Hi everyone, welcome to the final pass of secondary processes at P8. Identify appropriate heat treatment processes, secondary processes, finishing processes and assembly techniques for 4 given products. So this is just before we do the last M2. You're going to be using all of the knowledge that you've acquired throughout secondary processes so far to choose different processes, finishes and assembly techniques for 4 given products, and I will show you those later on. So I'm going to take you through a practice question now, which should give you 2 examples of how to answer your 4 questions that I give you. So we'll do those now. Okay, so I'm going to give you a product. In this case I've chosen a wheelbarrow bucket. So we're mainly going to be looking at the question at the left hand picture. We will be using the right hand picture for the final bit, which I'll talk about in a minute. So what I'm giving you here is a product, and you can see it says up here wheelbarrow bucket, and it also gives you an environment in which it will be used. So you've got to consider this when thinking about the treatments that it will receive. So this one says outdoors, so that will sort of lead us to some processes and not others, hopefully. So I'm going to ask you what the secondary process will be, then the heat treatment process, the finishing process, and then finally the assembly technique. So these ones here, the first 3, are going to be based on the left hand picture. This is the product I'm asking you about. But then the final assembly technique is about the second bit that it's going to attach to. So in this case you can see it's a wheelbarrow, and we've got to assemble the bucket of the wheelbarrow on the left to the frame on the right. So the assembly will be to do with that, the meeting of those 2 parts. Okay. Right, so I mentioned I'm going to give you a list of possible choices that you can choose from when thinking about the secondary process, heat treatment, finish and assembly techniques. You can see here is your chooser table, and I've split it up into 4 rows, which you can see. First of all, secondary processes. You can choose from any of the ones from the non-traditional or traditional list here. You obviously won't be using all of them. There's only going to be 4 questions. You've got to choose which ones you think are most appropriate. And as I say, I will be accepting alternative answers providing they're valid. So remember that. If you're not sure, I might accept it. So we've got milling, turning, casting, press forming and die cutting for traditional. And then we've got non-traditional, internal broaching, wire cut and die sink EDM, or cylinder honing or lapping. Heat treatment processes, we've got 3 to choose from: annealing, tempering or case hardening. Think carefully about those relating to the needs of the product. For finishes, I'm giving you a simple oil for a finish which can be coated onto metal products, painting, a simple process as well, but then on to galvanizing, anodizing and chrome plating. Again, you'll need to think about that usage using the information provided to you on the table, and make your choice relating to the best scenario for that particular product. And finally, assembly techniques. You can choose from machine screws, welding, dowels, key and keyway or nuts and bolts. To summarise, you'll notice that we've been through all of these on the course, and you can easily look back on your notes to see more about each of these if you want to research again. Right, so back onto our wheelbarrow bucket here. You'll remember the secondary process, heat treatment and finish are directed just at the left hand picture. The assembly technique here is to do with its attachment to this framework here. That will be the same in all the questions. I will give you a left hand product which will be what you'll be answering mostly, and then the last part will be about what it's then going to attach to. So what you need to do is sit down and think, what is the best treatment process for each of these 4 rows? Obviously you're going to want to think about the type of product, the environment it's in, and also look here at the type of material and the form that it comes in before making your choice. Just throwing in answers here without thinking is going to get you rework, which you don't want. So thinking carefully, and I've made the questions quite logical. They're going to be different, there's not going to be any overlapping answers. So starting with secondary processes, I sat and I thought, it's made of sheet steel, so what would create this shape? What would be the best method? And I was thinking, we looked at those bottle caps, didn't we, in our assignment, and the press forming process seemed quite logical. It could be sort of punched into shape on a huge press between 2 tools. That would obviously stretch the material and it would remain there, but it would also stress it, so we'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to go for here press forming. So as you can see in my answer, I've made it very clear what my choice is, and then I've given a brief sort of, I don't know, 3 lines to justify my choice. And as you can see, I've made it clear that it would be easy to press between positive and negative tools, and it would be simple because of its shape with slanted edges, which will allow it to be moulded quickly and easily, and you can also do multiples. So I've chosen press forming. Now I mentioned that the press forming will stress the atomic structure. You'll remember that from assignment 1. So basically we're going to need a heat treatment process which solves this. So I think you know which one I'm going to go for, the annealing process. That will, by heating it to 800 degrees C and letting it cool naturally, it will allow it to sort of get used to its new form, and then it will be able to withstand all of the treatment it will receive on a building site or in the garden without breaking. So I've chosen annealing, and I've mentioned in my answer that it will be more resistant to carrying the stress of loads now that it's relaxed. So I'm quite happy with those 2, they make sense. The finishing process now, number 3, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about the fact it's a wheelbarrow. It's not too technical a product, it's not that expensive, it's also going to be used outdoors, so we can't leave it sheet steel because it will rust. So I'm not going to go anything too high end here because people won't buy it if it's too expensive. Something like oil wouldn't do the trick. I'm going to go for a galvanizing. Now galvanise would give it that zinc layer that would protect it from rust. So I've mentioned here that it would give it its protection on the surface from corrosion, and also, unlike something like oil, it will give it a really nice sort of layer that will allow it to stand out and look pretty smart when it's up for sale in a shop. So I've gone for galvanising, the most appropriate in my mind. Okay, now we're thinking in the final part about how this is going to attach over onto here. Now when I look at this, I can see some clues. I'm going to leave you some clues in the pictures that I give you. Can you see these little holes here? Those would be really useful in attaching to the base of this. So I'm thinking this is going to need to be transported to a factory and then assembled. So it'd be quite nice for it to be a quick assembly technique. We wouldn't want it to be permanent, so I'm going to go for something semi-permanent like nuts and bolts. That could be easily assembled with a spanner, and obviously that would save space in transport, and then it could be quickly assembled into a wheelbarrow for use in the shops. So nuts and bolts, and finally I've described why I've chosen that. So as you can see here, one of your answers is going to come in 4 stages, and each of your choices for each stage is going to need a bit of justification. Not too much, but I need to know why you've chosen it. Okay, I thought I'd do two of these just to show you an alternative as well, and to show you, especially on our second one here, which is a pulley wheel that you can see down here. Sometimes I might give you this statement here, not applicable. Okay, so we'll talk about that. That means you don't have to put an answer in here. So I've got a pulley wheel. This holds a rope that wraps around it. The rope will go round and then down, and it will need to spin around an axle. So as you can see, I've given you the axle over here. We're going to attach it to that in the final assembly technique section. The rest of them are to do with the pulley wheel itself. Okay, now let's stop and look at the information provided first. This environment is indoors. It's made of solid aluminium, which isn't quite so corrosive as steel, and the fact it's indoors means we might be able to use different finishes, and you can see a different finish has been used. So first of all, our secondary process. This is a solid bit of aluminium here. So how was that created? Well, there are two things that we could choose here. You could turn that on a lathe, and I did think about that, but there's a little clue. This bit here could not be formed on a lathe. So that leads me to only one solid metal casting process. The casting would allow us to pour molten aluminium into a mould, and then we could get the solid shape of the pulley wheel in one go. It would be ideal. So I've gone for casting in this one. And of course I've written a little bit about the fact it's solid, and there's a few tricky little bits that you couldn't do on another machine. Now, the heat treatment process for second, there isn't going to be a heat treatment process here. For casting, you're not going to need one, because it cools down naturally and it will be relaxed. So there's a little clue there. If you see this, it might lead you to choose a previous technique like casting, which doesn't need a secondary heat treatment. Remember that. Okay, number 3, the finishing process here. We're looking to see what sort of aesthetics does this need. Now the fact it's blue pretty much gives it away to me. That can only be one of two processes really. Could be anodizing, although anodizing gives you a bit of a sort of transparent colour. The only solid colour technique I know about is painting. Does that suit this product? Well, yeah. I mean, it's going to be used indoors. It's not really on show. Nobody's going to be assessing its aesthetic quality too much. Does paint go on aluminium? It does. So I've chosen a paint finish, and I've made it clear it's not going to be on show, and it comes in a range of colours to suit the person selling the pulley wheel. It also has a bit of abrasion resistance as well that you could mention. Okay, now finally the assembly technique. How are we going to put this onto here? Now this is where you need to look carefully. There's a circular hole in here, nothing more, a circular hole, no threads, and there's a circular rod. This has got a spin around on that rod. The only problem is it could fall off the end of the rod. So where does that leave me with assembly techniques? Well, I'm thinking pretty much the only one that will allow something to spin on a rod and stop it from falling off the end is going to be a circlip. If you remember, a circlip from P6 is a little clip which you put in a groove that you've machined around the end of the rod. So you put the circlip in the machined groove, it would clip on, and then you could spin your pulley wheel around and it would be prevented from coming off, but would still spin on its own. So I've chosen the circlip. So this one is it's a similar answer to the first wheelbarrow one, but it's showing you a couple of things. You need to think about the product when choosing your answers, and also sometimes when you see this, it means you don't have to answer, and it might tell you what sort of process would be most suitable beforehand, which doesn't need a heat treatment.